The rising sun casts its first rays on the city of Chicago, illuminating the calm waters of the river and the historical building standing on its banks. In the heart of the business district, a modern glass and steel building stands out, the headquarters of BioLife, a promising biotech startup on the brink of a major breakthrough in the global pharmaceutical market. Ethan Reed, the young and ambitious CEO of BioLife, is already in his office before sunrise. His green eyes, usually bright with enthusiasm, now reflect a mix of anxiety and determination as he reviews the details of the contract that could change the fate of his company forever. "Mr. Reed," his assistant, Mary, calls through the intercom. "Your breakfast has arrived." Ethan sighs, realizing he has barely touched the coffee he ordered 2 hours ago. "Thank you, Mary. Could you bring it in, please?" A few moments later, Mary enters the office carrying a tray with fresh coffee, croissants, and a selection of fruits. She places the tray on the desk and looks worriedly at her boss. "Ethan, did you sleep here again?" she asks, noticing the deep circles under his eyes. He smiles wearily. "Another night, Mary. When we signed this contract with Global Pharma, I promised to take an entire weekend off." Mary shakes her head disapprovingly. "You said that last time, and the time before that." Ethan laughs as he grabs a croissant. "This time is different. This contract is a lifelong dream, Mary. 5 years of hard work, sleepless nights, and failed experiments have all led to this moment." As he speaks, his phone vibrates. It's a message from Philip Green, his research director and best friend since college. "Ethan, we need to talk. It's urgent. Meet me in the lab in 15 minutes. The tone of the message makes Ethan frown. Philip rarely sounded this serious. He quickly finishes his croissant and stands up. "Mary, cancel my 9 a.m. video conference. I need to go to the lab." 10 minutes later, Ethan enters BioLife's main laboratory. The familiar smell of chemicals and the hum of equipment usually calm him, but today, there is a palpable tension in the air. Philip is hunched over a microscope, his shoulders tense. When he hears Ethan enter, he turns around, his face a mask of worry. "Ethan, we have a problem. A big problem." Ethan's heart races. "What happened? A problem with the tests?" Philip shakes his head. "Worse. I think there's a leak." "A leak?" Ethan repeats, incredulous. "What do you mean?" Philip pulls out a tablet and shows Ethan a series of emails. "Look at this. It's a correspondence between someone on our team and BioRival." Ethan feels his blood run cold. BioRival was their main competitor, an enterprise that had been trying for years to surpass BioLife in the race to develop a revolutionary gene therapy. "This can't be possible," Ethan murmurs as he scrolls through the emails. Confidential details about their research, test schedules, even patent drafts, everything was there exposed. "Unfortunately, it's true," Philip says gravely. "And it's not just that. Look at the date on the last email." Ethan looks. "Last night. My God," he murmurs. "The contract with Global Pharma, if they find out." "Exactly," Philip says. "If Global Pharma discovers that our trade secrets have been compromised, they could cancel the deal." Ethan feels the weight of the world on his shoulders. All the work, all the sacrifices, everything could crumble because of a traitor. Who could do this? He asks more to himself than to Philip. Who would have access to all this information? Philip hesitates before answering. "Ethan, the level of detail in these emails, only someone high up in the company would have access to all this." The implication hung in the air between them. The circle of suspects was small, and included people Ethan trusted implicitly. "No," Ethan says firmly. "I can't believe someone from our core team would do this. There has to be another explanation." Philip puts a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I know it's hard to believe, but we need to face the facts. Someone is betraying us, and we need to find out who before it's too late. Ethan closes his eyes, trying to take it all in. The contract with Global Pharma was only days away from being signed. Years of work, millions of dollars in investment, the future of dozens of employees, everything was at stake. "All right," he says finally, opening his eyes with renewed determination. "We'll handle this, but discreetly. We can't let anyone know we're investigating, not even the rest of the executive team. The fewer people who know, the better." Philip nods. "And the contract? Should we postpone the signing?" Ethan shakes his head. "No. If we delay, Global Pharma will want to know why, and we can't risk them finding out about the leak. We have to continue as if nothing's wrong, while simultaneously finding the traitor and stopping the leak. It's risky," Philip warns. "I know," Ethan replies. "But we have no choice. BioLife is my life, Philip. I won't let anyone destroy it without a fight." As the two men discuss their next steps, the lab around them continued to buzz with activity, the scientists and technicians working tirelessly, unaware of the storm brewing at the heart of the company. Ethan knew the next few days would be crucial. He would need all his wits and instincts to unmask the traitor, protect his company, and save the contract that could change the future of medicine. The race against time had begun. Ethan entered his luxurious apartment overlooking the Chicago River 3 days after discovering the leak. He was no closer to identifying the traitor, and time was running out. The doorbell interrupted his thoughts. He opened the door to find his twin brother, Matthew, standing there. "So what's the big emergency?" Matthew asked, stepping into the apartment. "Your call sounded pretty dramatic." Ethan sighed. "Matthew, I need your help. It's a matter of life and death for BioLife." In the minutes that followed, Ethan explained the situation to his brother. Matthew listened intently, his eyes widening as he realized the gravity of the situation. "Let me get this straight," Matthew said when Ethan finished. "You want me to pose as an intern at your company to spy on your employees?" "That's exactly right. You're the only person I can fully trust, and as an actor, you have the skills to blend in without raising suspicion." Matthew laughed without humor. "An unemployed actor, you mean? My last role was a bit part in a cheese commercial 6 months ago." "Please, Matthew," Ethan pleaded. "You're my last hope." After a long silence, Matthew nodded. "All right, I'll do it, but you owe me big time." The following days were a whirlwind of preparation for Matthew's new role. Ethan taught him the basics of biotechnology, the company's routines, and the names and roles of key employees. On Monday morning, Matthew entered BioLife under the name Hugo Grant, the new intern in the Research and Development Department. From his office, Ethan nervously watched the security cameras. Mary, Ethan's assistant, was the first to greet the new intern. "Welcome to BioLife, Hugo," she said with a warm smile. "Let me show you to your workstation." Matthew smiled, trying to stay calm. "Thank you very much," he replied, immediately realizing his mistake when he saw Mary frown slightly. "I mean, thank you," he quickly corrected, suppressing his natural accent. "I'm excited to get started." Mary gave him a tour of the office, introducing him to various colleagues. Matthew did his best to memorize the names and faces, while staying alert for any suspicious behavior. In the main lab, he was introduced to Dr. Sarah Carter, the lead researcher. Matthew's heart raced when their eyes met. "Nice to meet you, Dr. Carter," he said, trying to keep his composure. "Call me Sarah," she smiled. "I hope you enjoy working with us, Hugo." Throughout the day, Matthew struggled to maintain his cover. Every time he was asked a question about biotechnology, he felt beads of sweat form on his forehead. "Hugo, what do you think of the latest advancements in gene therapy?" a colleague asked during lunch. Matthew swallowed hard. It's fascinating, isn't it? So many possibilities, he replied vaguely. As the week went on, Matthew grew more comfortable in his role. Each night, he observed, listened, and reported his findings to Ethan. However, maintaining his cover proved to be a constant challenge. More than once, he found himself slipping into his natural accent, earning curious looks from his colleagues. "Hugo, you're not from around here, are you?" Sarah asked one day as they worked together in the lab. Matthew's heart pounded. "No," he admitted quickly. "I grew up in New York but moved to Chicago for school. I'm still getting used to the local accent." Sarah laughed. "That explains a lot. Don't worry, your secret is safe with me." Matthew smiled, feeling both relieved and guilty. He had come to genuinely like Sarah and his other colleagues. The thought that one of them might be the traitor deeply disturbed him. As his first week as Hugo drew to a close, Matthew found himself torn between his loyalty to Ethan and the new friendships he was forming. He knew he had to find the traitor quickly before his cover was blown, or worse, before he started to question whose side he was really on. Weeks passed since Matthew assumed the identity of Hugo Grant at BioLife. Each day, he felt more at ease in his role as an intern, but also increasingly conflicted about his true mission. One Wednesday morning, Matthew was working in the lab when Sarah approached, a warm smile on her face. "Hugo, can you help me with some calculations?" she asked, placing a stack of papers on the workbench. "Sure," Matthew replied, feeling his heart race as it always did when Sarah was near. "What do you need?" As they worked together, Matthew couldn't help but notice the sparkle in Sarah's eyes when she talked about her work. Her passion for science was contagious. "You know, Hugo," Sarah said once the calculations were done, "you're surprisingly good for an intern. Are you sure you don't have a hidden PhD somewhere?" Matthew laughed nervously. "No, I just learned quickly, I guess." Sarah studied him for a moment. "There's something about you, Hugo. Something familiar. I can't quite put my finger on it." Before Matthew could respond, Philip entered the lab, looking agitated. "Sarah, I need to talk to you in private," he said, casting a suspicious glance at Matthew. Sarah frowned but followed Philip out of the lab. Matthew watched them through the glass door, noting their tense body language. In the days that followed, Matthew began paying more attention to Philip. The research director seemed increasingly nervous, making phone calls in hushed tones in secluded corners and staying late at the office. One evening, after everyone had left, Matthew decided to stay and keep an eye on Philip. Hidden behind a row of cabinets, he watched as Philip sneaked into the main lab, looking around as if afraid of being seen. Matthew's heart pounded. Could Philip be the traitor? His thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. "Hugo, what are you doing here so late?" Matthew turned, surprised to find Sarah behind him, looking curious. "I forgot my phone," he stammered, searching for an excuse. Sarah didn't seem convinced. "Hugo, there's something you're not telling me." At that moment, looking into Sarah's concerned eyes, Matthew felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He wanted to tell her everything, the leak, his true identity, the growing feelings he had for her. "Sarah, he began, but he was interrupted by approaching footsteps. Philip emerged from the lab, looking surprised to see them both. "What are you two doing here?" Philip asked, his voice tense. "We could ask you the same thing," Sarah replied, her voice loaded with suspicion. A tense silence settled over the trio. Matthew looked from Sarah to Philip, feeling the weight of their secrets like never before. In the days that followed, Matthew was torn between his mission, his suspicions about Philip, and his feelings for Sarah. Every interaction with her made him question his choices. "Hugo, have you ever considered a career in research?" Sarah asked one day over lunch. "You have a natural talent for it." Matthew smiled sadly. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm on the right path," he replied, his words loaded with a meaning that escaped Sarah. At night, in his reports to Ethan, Matthew found himself omitting details about Sarah, instinctively protecting her. "Philip is acting strange," he told Ethan during one of their nightly conversations. "I think we should focus on him." Ethan looked skeptical. "Philip is my best friend, Matthew." "Are you sure?" Matthew hesitated. Was he really sure of anything at this point? As the days passed, Matthew felt he was reaching a breaking point. His suspicions about Philip grew, as did his feelings for Sarah. The guilt of deceiving her gnawed at him. One evening, as he watched Sarah working late in the lab, Matthew made a decision. He couldn't continue this charade. If they were going to risk everything to do the right thing, he had to be completely honest with them. "Sarah," Matthew began softly, his heart pounding in his chest, "I need to tell you something." Matthew was about to reveal his true identity to Sarah when the sound of a door closing abruptly interrupted him. Sarah and he exchanged confused looks. "Who else is here at this hour?" Sarah murmured. Matthew signaled for her to stay quiet, and they both moved silently toward the source of the noise. Rounding a corner, they saw light coming from under the door to Philip's office. Suddenly, Philip's agitated voice echoed down the empty hallway. "No, you don't understand the gravity of the situation," Philip shouted into the phone. "They're going too far." Matthew and Sarah crept closer to the door, trying to hear more. "I know I promised more proof, but it's risky," Philip continued, his voice lower now. "If Ethan finds out it's me..." Matthew's heart raced. Philip was indeed the informant. But something didn't add up. Why did he seem so concerned? "I understand that the Research Ethics Agency needs more than my word," Philip sighed. "I promise I'll get the documents to prove the illegality of the tests. I just need more time." At that moment, Matthew accidentally leaned on the door, which creaked open. Philip turned around abruptly, his face pale with shock. "I'll call you back," he muttered into the phone before hanging up. "What are you two doing here?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling with anger and confusion. "The question is, what are you doing, Philip? What's this about illegal tests?" Philip collapsed into his chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "You weren't supposed to hear that." "But we did," Matthew said, his mind racing. "And now you're going to tell us everything." For a long moment, Philip was silent, looking from Matthew to Sarah. Finally, he took a deep breath. "It started a few months ago," he began. "I noticed discrepancies in the test reports, results that were too good to be true. Investigating further, I discovered that Ethan had authorized human trials without ethical approval." Sarah exclaimed, "That's impossible. Ethan would never do such a thing." Philip shook his head sadly. "I didn't want to believe it either, but the proof is there. Ethan is so focused on securing the deal with Global Pharma that he's willing to bypass crucial safety steps." Matthew felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. His brother involved in unethical experiments? "Why didn't you confront Ethan directly?" he asked, struggling to maintain his cover. "I tried," Philip replied, "but he assured me everything was under control, that these were necessary shortcuts. When I realized he wasn't going to stop, I decided to contact the Research Ethics Agency." "So you're the informant?" Sarah murmured, still reeling from the revelation. Philip nodded. "Yes, but not to harm the company. I'm trying to save it from itself." Matthew's world spun. His brother was not the victim but the villain, and Philip, the prime suspect, was trying to do the right thing. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Philip looked at both of them, his eyes filled with determination. "Now I need your help. We must gather tangible evidence before someone gets hurt in these illegal experiments." Matthew felt the weight of his initial mission fade. He had come to find a traitor, but ended up uncovering a much larger conspiracy. He now faced an impossible choice: protect his brother or do what was right. "You can count on us," Matthew said, aware that this decision would change everything. The silence that followed Philip's revelation was palpable. Matthew felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving him dizzy and disoriented. His brother Ethan, the man he admired and trusted, was at the heart of illegal and potentially dangerous experiments. "Are you sure about this, Philip?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "There might be some misunderstanding." Philip shook his head sadly. "I wish there were, Sarah, but I have tangible evidence." He turned to his computer and opened a series of files. "Look at this." Matthew and Sarah leaned in to look at the screen. Detailed experiment reports, test results, and, most disturbingly, lists of volunteers with codes instead of names. "These are the unauthorized tests?" Matthew asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. Philip nodded. "Exactly. Ethan started these tests about 3 months ago, when it became clear we wouldn't have conclusive results in time for the global pharma deal." Sarah frowned. "But that makes no sense. Safety protocols exist for a reason. Skipping steps can have catastrophic consequences." "That's exactly what concerns me," Philip said. "Ethan is so focused on closing this deal that he's lost all perspective. He believes the end justifies the means." Matthew felt a wave of nausea. He knew Ethan's ambitious side well, but he never imagined his brother would go this far. "And the volunteers?" Matthew asked. "Do they know the risks?" Philip's silence was answer enough. "My God," Sarah murmured, horrified. Matthew grappled with his internal turmoil. Every fiber of his being wanted to defend Ethan, find an explanation, a justification. But the evidence was irrefutable. "What exactly are these experiments?" Matthew asked, dreading the answer. Philip hesitated before replying. "It's a new gene therapy. In theory, it could cure several degenerative diseases, but the animal tests were inconclusive. Ethan decided to move directly to human trials." "That's madness," Sarah exclaimed. "Without sufficient animal data, the risks to humans are enormous." Matthew felt his world crumble. His brother, the brilliant scientist, the visionary, was endangering lives for what? Ambition? Profit? "How much time do we have?" Matthew asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Philip looked confused. "What do you mean? How long before these experiments cause irreversible damage?" Matthew clarified, feeling the weight of responsibility. "It's hard to say," Philip replied. "But based on the data I have, I'd say we have at most a week before side effects start to manifest significantly." Matthew closed his eyes, trying to process everything. When he opened them, he saw Sarah and Philip watching him, waiting for his reaction. At that moment, Matthew made his decision. It didn't matter that Ethan was his brother. It didn't matter that the mission that had brought him to BioLife was to find a traitor. What mattered was the lives at stake. "We need to stop this," Matthew declared firmly. "We can't let this continue." Sarah nodded, determination shining in her eyes. "I agree. But how?" "We need to gather all the evidence," Philip said. "Documents, lab reports, anything that proves what's going on." "And then?" Matthew asked. "Then we take everything to the Research Ethics Agency," Philip replied. "They have the power to shut down the experiments immediately." Matthew felt his stomach knot. He would be betraying his brother, but the alternative, allowing the dangerous experiments to continue, was unthinkable. "All right," Matthew said, taking a deep breath. "Let's do this." As the three of them began to plan their next steps, Matthew couldn't help but think of Ethan. How would his brother react when he found out? How would it affect their relationship? But he knew he had no choice. Sometimes doing the right thing meant making difficult decisions, And this decision was undoubtedly the hardest Matthew had ever faced. Philip's office was filled with tense silence as Matthew, Sarah, and Philip discussed their plan. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on them, each aware of the risks involved in exposing BioLife's unethical practices. Matthew looked at Sarah and Philip, feeling the weight of his own secrets. He knew he couldn't continue this charade. If they were going to risk everything to do the right thing, he had to be completely honest with them. "Before we go any further," Matthew said, his voice trembling, "there's something you need to know about me." Sarah and Philip exchanged confused looks. Matthew took a deep breath. "My name isn't Hugo Grant," he began. "I'm Matthew Reed, Ethan's twin brother." The shock was palpable on Sarah and Philip's faces. "What?" Sarah exclaimed. "But how? Why?" Matthew quickly explained the information leak, the initial suspicion of a traitor, and how Ethan had convinced him to infiltrate the company. "I came here to find a traitor," he concluded, "but I've uncovered something much worse." Philip shook his head in disbelief. "That explains a lot. Your familiarity with procedures, your advanced knowledge for an intern." Sarah looked hurt. "So it was all a lie? Our friendship, our conversations?" "No," Matthew said desperately. "My identity was false, but my feelings for you, Sarah, are real." A moment of charged silence followed, heavy with emotion. "I understand if you don't trust me anymore," Matthew continued. "But believe me when I say I want to do what's right. I want to help end these illegal experiments, no matter the personal cost." Philip was the first to speak. "I suppose having the CEO's twin brother on our side could be useful." Sarah still seemed hesitant, but she nodded slowly. "What matters now is stopping more people from getting hurt." With the truth out, the three of them began planning with renewed determination. They decided that Philip would continue to gather evidence from within the company, while Matthew would use his access as Hugo to obtain additional information. Sarah would organize all the data and prepare a detailed report for the Research Ethics Agency. "We have to be quick and discreet," Philip warned. "If Ethan suspects anything—" Suddenly, the office door swung open violently. Ethan stood in the doorway, his face a mask of fury and betrayal. "This is how you repay me," he growled. "Conspiring behind my back?" Matthew's blood ran cold. How long had Ethan been listening? "Ethan," Matthew began, taking a step toward his brother. "This has to stop. What you're doing is dangerous and unethical." Ethan laughed bitterly. "Unethical? I'm trying to save lives. You don't understand what's at stake." "We understand perfectly," Sarah said firmly. "But the ends don't justify the means. You're putting people in danger. Traitors, all of you," Ethan muttered, his eyes narrowing. "Philip, my best friend. Sarah, my brightest researcher. And you, Matthew, my own brother." "Ethan, please," Matthew pleaded. "It's not too late to make things right. We can find another way." For a moment, Ethan seemed to waver, but his face hardened. "No," he said coldly. "I've worked too hard and sacrificed too much to give up now. If you're not with me, you're against me." With that, Ethan turned and quickly left the office. Matthew, Sarah, and Philip looked at each other, the gravity of the situation sinking in. They knew the real battle was just beginning. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Matthew clenched his fists, determination shining in his eyes. "Now it's a race against time. We have to bring the truth to light before Ethan can cover it up, or worse." As they left Philip's office, Matthew couldn't help but wonder if the bond with his twin brother could ever be repaired after this. But he knew he had made the right choice. Some things were more important than blood ties. The race to save BioLife, and potentially many lives, had begun. BioLife's main laboratory was filled with tense silence as Matthew entered, followed closely by Sarah and Philip. Ethan had his back turned, leaning over a bench, gripping the edge tightly. "Ethan," Matthew said softly, "we need to talk." Ethan turned slowly, his eyes reflecting a mix of anger and disappointment. "What is there to say? You've already decided to betray me. It's not betrayal to want to do the right thing," Sarah argued. Ethan laughed bitterly. "The right thing? You don't understand what's at stake. Then explain it to us," Philip challenged. "Justify why putting lives at risk is the right thing to do." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "You don't see it. These experiments could cure diseases that are currently incurable. We could save millions of lives. At what cost?" Matthew asked. "Ethan, you're playing God. This isn't ethical." "Ethics," Ethan scoffed. "Ethics don't cure diseases. Ethics don't save lives. Sometimes we have to make tough choices for the greater good." While they argued, none of them noticed one of the pieces of equipment beginning to overheat. A spark flew, igniting nearby papers. "Fire!" Sarah shouted as flames quickly spread across the bench, fueled by chemicals and paper. "Everyone out!" Philip yelled, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her towards the exit. "Matthew, come on!" Philip and Sarah made it outside, but Ethan was paralyzed, staring in horror at the flames consuming years of work. "Ethan!" Matthew shouted, running back into the lab. "We have to get out of here. I can't lose it all," Ethan murmured, clutching a data server, trying to protect it from the flames. "Your life is more important than any research," Matthew insisted, pulling Ethan towards the exit. At that moment, a burning beam crashed down, blocking their path. The brothers looked at each other, fear mirrored in their identical eyes. "Matthew," Ethan said softly, despite the chaos around them. "I'm sorry for everything." Matthew squeezed his brother's hand. "Me too. But let's get out of here together, okay?" With a joint effort, they managed to push aside some equipment, creating a narrow passage. Coughing and stumbling, they finally emerged from the burning lab, collapsing into the arms of Sarah and Philip as the sound of approaching fire sirens filled the air. They watched as BioLife's building was engulfed in flames. Years of research, a multi-million-dollar contract, the future of the company, all went up in smoke. Matthew looked at Ethan, who appeared defeated and lost. "What do we do now?" Ethan asked quietly. Matthew met his brother's gaze. "I don't know. But thank you for saving me, despite everything." Ethan nodded, a small, sad smile forming on his lips. "We're brothers. We'll always be there for each other, no matter what." As the firefighters worked to control the blaze, the four of them stood together, watching the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. The future of BioLife and the relationship between the Reed brothers remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again.